Okay, I'm Mariam Ismail. I come from a construction engineering background. I did my undergrad at the American University in Cairo, then my master's here at Cambridge University, and currently I'm pursuing my PhD here as well. I'm one of the owners and managing partners of the company we're going to talk about today, which is INFIT. I think a bit of a background information could be very relevant to this interview. So we established the joint venture, and afterwards we took an already existing factory unit at the German counterpart site apart. We reverse engineered it and put it back into operations in Egypt. And as you can imagine, there was a wealth of experience and exposure to know-how transfer in that context. So what happened is operators and engineers they traveled to Germany for training, and afterwards several German engineers came back to manage the transfer of the manufacturing technology as well as the know-how over 3 years. And as you can imagine, 3 years is a relatively long period of time. But what happened subsequently is that INFIT was able to deploy a sort of systematic approach or program that was also applied several times afterwards. And that systematic program can be probably divided into 3 critical phases. So it's the first phase, which is the technology transfer, then the second phase, which is the absorption, and the last phase, which is the internalization. When I'm talking about the technology transfer, I really mean the technology acquisition itself. So INFIT screens the market for new technologies, and it also takes an internal look at its very own needs and requirements. So it's very important here to have a very strategic perspective, because it's not always the latest and newest technologies that are relevant. The sort of alignment between the new or existing and needed technologies and the internal resources and capabilities is really important. And this is why we often resort to incremental changes. You know, sometimes exposure to very radical changes all of a sudden can actually harm other operational capabilities, and this is something you definitely want to avoid. So for the second part, I'm talking here about the absorption, and this is the absorptive capacity of the firm. And that really means the extent to which INFIT can digest the manufacturing technologies that it has gained, operate the machineries, and also maintain them. So it's important here to realize that sometimes the absorptive capacity is very limited, or it's not really suitable for the technologies that are being acquired, even if they're just incremental changes. So what INFIT does is it always brings the engineers from abroad on site to be able to help during the installation, troubleshooting, and also maintenance of the machinery. And you know, this exposure and this type of collaboration definitely strengthens the firm's internal capabilities as well. Now in the last part, which is the internalization, a sort of independence emerges. The firm is able to internalize and digest the process, and it's also allowing itself to grow. And in that phase, INFIT resorts to codification processes. It codifies the knowledge it has gained from the foreigners instead of relying on their tacit experience. A very important thing that I would like to highlight is the formation of some sort of a frugal innovation. It comes after the accumulated gained experience. And let me give you a very quick example. Instead of buying spare parts of those machineries from abroad, INFIT has managed to develop a capability to be able to actually produce those spare parts. You know, spare parts could be very expensive, and they also have very long lead times. You know, there's a lot of incentives for the workers in that process as well, but this is irrelevant. I think it really depends on the business context and the reason for the know-how transfer. So are you building capabilities from scratch? Are you leveraging already existing ones? Or are you trying to acquire completely new ones into the firm? I was talking here about a case where there was a long exposure to know-how. It took them 3 years to do that. And so time was definitely on our side. Um, I think this approach could be very suitable for when there is a definitive gap between the two parties involved. But let me give you an example of a completely opposite scenario. And that's when firms are seeking very radical innovations and very radical technologies. So in that case, maybe the three phases that I was talking about will exist, but their nature will completely differ. This is because they're looking at very new technologies, they're at the technology frontier already, and probably the internalization process will take much less time. What I want to stress here is the codification process. I think it has proven to be very, very effective, and especially if you're looking at the sustainability of that know-how. As for the customization, I think firms really need to have a very good look and assessment of their resources and capabilities, and also link them to the innovation degrees they're seeking. Also for the customization, I think firms really need to be very open and very flexible in order to allow time for sort of a trial and error phase until they can reach the optimum way to go on about such a transfer. They've definitely put quite a lot of effort into it, but in these circumstances, I always like to think of perhaps the number one business rule: what's in it for me? So, what was in it for them? Let's take a look at the business context. So, Vista was also a customer for many years. So, INFIT was producing a lot of fittings under the German's name in the German market, and that was probably the key driver for that level of commitment. So production in Egypt definitely gave Vista a cost advantage, but they didn't want to compromise that cost advantage with the quality of their products, especially when operating in a country like Germany. So they had to come up with a very smart way to be able to ensure the consistency of the performance, the quality that they needed in the market, and also they wanted to reduce the constant engagement efforts they had to put into. And they came up with a smart approach, and that was the codification part. So codifying the transfer was really key in that stage, and that was done in form of written manuals for the operating processes, for quality assurances, and also designing functions. You can see this codifying process really cut across the entire organization and all its functions. It even integrated a lot of supporting functions such as the inventory units, planning departments, and also purchasing departments. Another thing that was really integral in that process was gauging against specified KPIs to ensure consistent performance throughout. And as you can see, the standardization of processes is really, really important. Another thing that I really wanted to stress is to observe the evolution of coordination mechanisms. So we started with the need of a direct supervision under the German engineers, and then we slowly progressed until we had the standard operating procedures where we didn't really need a direct supervision anymore. The beauty of the standard operating procedures can also be felt from an organizational perspective, because those SOPs, they're not really threatened by employee turnovers. I like to compare the concept of taking on new capabilities with an organ transplant. It has to be done very slowly and gradually to allow the firm to adapt to it. Otherwise, it could be very disruptive, and this is something you want to avoid. Another thing is, don't be overly dependent on them. It comes at a very high cost to be constantly depending on the capabilities from abroad or from foreign partners. But let me stress here the word constantly. You really want to have a long-term vision and also a systematic approach in order to be able to acquire new capabilities to create value. Another thing is to pay attention to organization learning, which is really an integral part. It allows the firm to configure itself in a certain way that allows it to integrate current capabilities with the newly acquired ones. And this definitely gives a company a new competitive advantage with the least possible financial burden.